Good evening, and I think I had the privilege of doing the first inaugural panel and probably the last one to a very, very successful, hugely successful IVCA conclave. I'm sure you have all set the benchmark high, and I know Rajat has got the message well, where we're going to have the next conclave. I think the venue is definitely not able to keep up with the size of participation. And that, I think, also very clearly signifies where the industry has really come to and grown. So I think welcome for this session. And again, as the announcement was made, we wanted to keep this session more interactive. So obviously, and I think I probably will have one of the largest panels here. And probably if you add up the experience across the panelists here, I think it represents the entire cross-section and evolution of the alternative space. So I mean, I think you couldn't have asked for anyone better to talk about the regulatory framework. And I think you have two past chairpersons from IVCA who have been path-breaking in kind of bringing IVCA to a level where it has become a true representative of the industry with very, very active engagement with policymakers. And then you have all the knowledge partners here who have also seen the growth of IVCA and also the industry as a whole. So I think you're going to kind of hear some interesting discussion points. And obviously, to add more spice to the whole thing, we've all been seeing how the regulatory framework has really been evolving, and maybe I would say some of it to our liking, some of it maybe not to our liking. But I think what would be important as a part of this discussion here is obviously to see how we as stakeholders in this industry see the regulatory framework evolving in the Amrit Kal. And I think with that, I thought I would want to really start off with you, Gopal, and how do you see the regulatory framework? And I think you've been not just been an important part of the industry, but also been one of the strong influencers of how the policy framework has evolved. So where do you see things really evolving from where we are to where we want to be?
Thank you. Thank you, Sid. And I think it was interesting. I was just reflecting as you were speaking. It was about 15 years ago to this day when I went to SEBI, if I remember right, or maybe 16 years as the chairman of the CII National Private Equity and Venture Capital Committee. And we met a person in SEBI. So the person, there were four or five of us, and I think one person is in the room who was with me that day. And we asked the question, he asked the question, where are you from? So we said, sir, we represent the Private Equity Association, Private Equity Industry India. He looked at all of us and said, we don't recognize any concept called private equity. So I just think it's nice to pause for a second and just see where we are today. How much progress has been made, just as India has progress, no doubt, whether it's the new regulations here, whether it's the tension between the regulator and the regulatees, because one wants to grow and the other wants to make sure safety is there. All very good intentions, no doubt. And the fact that there is things like IFSCA, which some of the people here are experts on, which are really signaling the arrival of a new India. So I just think it's absolutely a fantastic time. And I think Amrit Kal can't come soon enough for all of us in this room. But I just have only one thing to say as a remark about the future. Everything in the future depends on, I think was it the Mad Hatter telling Alice in Wonderland when she says, which way should I go? And she says, it depends on where you want to go. And I think remembering that quote, I always think that where we want to go should be set. Do we want to go to a place where there's amazing set of rules and regulations with Six Sigma adherence? Or do we want to develop a country which has got a 10 trillion GDP, where entrepreneurs are getting money, growth is getting money, stress assets are being turned around, infra and real estate is well funded, private credit is well known? Or do we want to go even further to a point where we say India can do for private capital management what it did for IT services? And it can actually be the talent hub. After all, everywhere you go, it seems like Indians are managing some or large parts of private funds, and also are very good lawyers and chartered accountants and so forth. So is that the goal? Then I think we need to work back from there. So to me, an idea of Amrit Kal of India is an idea where India is recognized as a source of phenomenally good private capital management, and we're all thinking about how to invest and have teams on the ground in other countries, managing money for LPs across the world, not just for India, but across other locations. I think we work back from there, and then the regulators really need to set tracks to reach that goal, rather than worry about the important problems which they are worried about today, no doubt. So that's what I would hope for when we meet 15 years later.
I think very well articulated, and I think that's what, as an industry, I think maybe we've come of age, and probably a regulator also needs to change the approach of, rather than firefighting with the issues here, look forward, work back where we want the industry to go. And I think that's definitely how we would want the regulations to really look like. Paddy, I know you were probably amongst the early ones who initiated this engagement with the government and the policymakers during your term as well at IVCA. And obviously, you've seen how things have come about. AIF has now celebrated its first decade as a very progressive regulations from where it started. I mean, would be great to kind of hear your thoughts on how you have seen this change, and I mean, what do you think your wish list would be for the regulators?
Sure, sir. Thank you. So I'll just continue from where Gopal left off. I think, to me, my sort of goal for Amrit Kal would be have the best-in-class frameworks in India, such that Indian private equity managers can get the best results for the stakeholders. And in my mind, fewer rules, but strong enforcement of the rules is probably the way out. And I think to Gopal's earlier point, India has shown from GIFT IFSC that when we want, we can create the top-notch frameworks, right? I think GIFT has that such that it should go beyond managing money for India to Indian origin managers managing it for emerging markets as well, potentially. So I think one more thing I saw was when I had the privilege of moderating the first ever engagement we as a community had with the Indian Prime Minister, Honorable Prime Minister. And that was a terrific, eye-opening experience. The kind of sort of understanding of private equity and venture capital as an asset class just amazed me, because I was sort of privileged to be involved in some of the preparatory work for that. And it's a long way from a time when a regulator said that they didn't really understand what private equity is. So I think there is a strong recognition of our asset class and the role it has to play in the Indian economy. After all, Indians are known to be good entrepreneurs, good service providers. So private equity fits in well into all those requirements, and it can help to create thousands and thousands of successful businesses and investors in those businesses. But the balance I think we have to draw is between having rules and frameworks which are targeted at the bad apples, because there'll always be some bad apples. Rather have fewer rules and frameworks, but strictly enforce them, such that those who play by the rules can really innovate and get the best returns for their stakeholders.
No, I think, again, very, very important that as the industry is matured, and I think the approach for the regulators also need to kind of mature and reach a level where, I mean, the way I look at it, whether we move from a shotgun approach to a rifle approach of dealing with issues, rather than using an approach which can, at times, stunt the growth. I think maybe that's something from a wish list perspective we would want to see more and more of the policy framework really evolving around that. I know just before we move on to the other panelists, and because we want to try and also make it as interactive, maybe we'll keep opening it up for the audience here. I mean, if there are any comments or observations to make on the topic, on the regulatory framework, anything, I mean, just feel free to raise your hand and we'll try and see if we can. So I don't know, maybe at this point, if there are any initial thoughts from anyone before we kind of move on. So maybe I think keep your thoughts and observations ready. I think we'll keep coming back on that. So I think just coming to you, Pallavi, and I think we all as knowledge partners for the industry and been very actively involved in at least doing our 2 bits to see how the framework can really achieve the purpose of being progressive, at the same time address some of the regulators' concern, because obviously, how do you see the regulatory framework today, and in your own wish list as a lawyer, as someone who can influence policy making? How do you see things really shaping up from here on?
So I think from the time that, we moved out from the VCF sort of regime into the AIF regime, which was supposed to be light touch, and we were looking at, fund managers being more responsible. We're looking at sophisticated investors participating in AIF products, and therefore this not requiring so much regulatory oversight, to now, where I think concept papers are just coming one after the other, literally by the week. I think it's a running joke that, they release these circulars on Fridays to ensure that, the weekend is kind of totally gone in figuring out what is going to come up and what is going to be the law finally when it does. I think overall, we are obviously as an industry, and all of us are aware of some of the challenges that we face today, both coming in from some of the SEBI circulars and some of the RBI circulars, and how they've come overnight with hardly any time to prepare, and the consequences that fund managers face as a result. I think some of them, in terms of the thought process and where they're coming from, is totally justified. For example, evergreening has been a concern, and therefore, there are measures which are required. But then to come out with a circular which kind of puts a very open, plain, sort of jacket ban on banks in particular, without really any framework in place to sort of, help the other fund managers who are genuinely sort of looking at this LP base, can be, is actually leading to consequences today in the markets. Similarly, for SEBI, sort of, the continuation funds as a concept, it's a great concept. There are fund managers who are facing challenges at the end of the term. But then some of the other things in terms of the bid process, etc., how practical that is also a question mark. So I think, yes, the intent is definitely the right thing in terms of getting these regulations in place. But I think we also have to understand, like Paddy said and like Gopal said, there are certain situations that need addressing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone as a whole is kind of painted with the same color.
No, I mean, again, rightfully so. And I think while it's welcome that the process of rulemaking, and I think having seen the transition from a VCF to an FVCI to an AIF and maybe many more, you've seen very clearly more and more consultations. And I think that's the most welcome move, I would say, from a regulator perspective, because we've seen days when it used to be a surprise. One fine day you'll have a regulation coming out and then you all will be like running around trying to understand. Here at least you get the opportunity to engage, and I think that definitely communicates that the regulators have become far more engaging. But yes, I think the approach, again, where the regulators really need to get more and more prescriptive for this asset class, or maybe a principle-based approach, I think maybe that's where a balance somewhere needs to be struck. And I think maybe over the last few years, at least the last couple of years, we've seen there been an overdrive, and I think the perception which I think has got created, and maybe maybe not intended, but definitely created, is the fact that the industry is under a constant scrutiny by a regulator. And I think that at times becomes counterproductive to the ambition of really growing this asset class. And I think maybe that's one of the areas where I think definitely we should see more consistency from a policy making, and that's probably what I would think would be a wish list from us as policymakers. I think moving on to Tushar, I think obviously you have been pretty active with the industry and whatever on the, both you and Subbu, when it comes to anything around tax and the issues, and the industry has gone through a significant number of those issues over the years. And I think you guys have always been very actively involved. How do you see, and where do you see in the Amrit Kal regime, as we would call this, where do you think the tax challenges for the industry, or what would be your wish list to see from the taxmen?
So I think, of course, a lot has been said. And we have achieved a lot, I must say. So it's not that we haven't achieved anything, right? From a VCF regulation to AIF regulation. I remember when the AIF regulation came, there was no pass-through. Yeah. So there was a lot of issues that the industry was facing. We went as an industry, of course, NIVCA, into the representations, CAT 3 versus CAT 2 versus CAT 1. It went on for a while, and we realized we need to segregate. And then, of course, finally, at least for a CAT 1 and CAT 2, you got passed through. So, which is in line with what is happening to industry internationally. Of course, that's a very important steps. And we have achieved Section 56 amendment. So there are many such wins and significant wins that over a period of time that IVCA and the industry has achieved. But of course, there are few issues that we have raised time and again in the past on the tax fronts. Things like the long-term capital gain holding period, right? So public market versus private, mainly private equity. Why should it not be 1 year versus 2 years? The tax rate applicable to public market security being long-term capital gain of 10% versus 20%. So these are some of the important aspects in a long term to consider. Again, on the GST front, and we're all aware about the latest ruling on the GST and on the carried interest issue. That's been asked to get certainty. The industry is a fiduciary industry, right? So we're dealing with third-party money. So as a manager, the appetite for a corporate to take risk and calls is significantly higher. But when it comes to private equity as a sector and industry, we don't have appetite for litigation at all, right? We want certainty. So, which is where, and if you look at internationally, whether it is US, whether it is UK, there is a clear, certain rule defined, right? That your 3-year holding period now in the US, then we'll treat carry as capital gain, right? Similarly, in UK, there are clear rules applicable. So what we are asking from the government is to come out with those clear rules so that you know what is the play field that you are playing on. So those are some of the critical aspects we need to kind of get to answers. And of course, we need to keep on benchmarking ourselves to the Western world. Good part is that we have a lot to learn because the industry is significantly more mature when it comes to Western world. Of course, on the regulation firm, I leave it to...
Do you still think that benchmarking is still acceptable for the regulators, or they think...
So, which is where I think we need to... I understand that India will have its own issues. The type of investors, the sophistication levels of the investors is very different. So, there will be tweaks which are acceptable, but to the extent you have to start with why not, right? Asking a question, why shouldn't we shouldn't benchmark ourselves to what is the matured best practices in the world, and then make those tweaks which are required for adoption to India, right? In terms of circumstances here.
No, I mean I think maybe in some way, while SEBI or RBI as regulators have been far more consultative, I think at times we feel taxman has its own mind, and many a times challenges that we have come across. I mean, a 56 out of the blue, where no one ever thought it was an anti-abuse provision, suddenly became a charging provision and started impacting an industry. I think maybe that's probably an area where there has to be a lot more alignment. And then maybe that's probably where we think there's a lot more work to be done. Subbu, over to you, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Siddharth. I think, I'll just pick a leaf from what Gopal said. And I think, so I've had a very close ringside view of how things have evolved, at least from 2014 when I've been actively working with the IVCA. Obviously, the regulators' perception of this industry has grown, I don't know how many fold, as in it's sort of changed dramatically from the initial days where the industry was viewed with a lot of skepticism to where we are now. But I think aspirationally, if you ask me, Tushar, of course, highlighted some of the critical issues that need to get resolved. But I think if you really look at it from an Amrit Kal perspective and you really look at the vision for the future, I think what becomes very important is that we need to move away from having to deal with regulators, I'm talking about tax and regulators equally, of having to deal with issues frictionally. Today, every time a budget happens, there are 4 new, spokes that are thrown at the industry to say that, okay, fine, now there's an angel tax for non-residents and, okay, spending the next 2 months of advocacy effort to sort of resolve it to the satisfaction of the industry. But the point is, there's always this classical debate, for instance, in tax that, today, if, SEBI or RBI or other regulators in India can take a very consultative process before introduction of any regulation, why does budget need to still happen the way it happened in the British Raj? As in, why can't budget be a consultative process where, you're not really discovering something as a bill which comes secretly on Feb 1 and, you have to spend the next 3 months sort of resolving and troubleshooting. So some of those things I think become very important because there are intentions behind everything that the government does, undoubtedly. They are well-intentioned. I don't think they mean to disrupt something which is going well. But the unfortunate consequence of it is that this industry, the 99% of this industry gets negatively impacted by changes which then have to, and especially when you look at a global LP base and, investor comfort, investor sentiment, frequent changes to law, frequent changes to policy, do act as a big deterrent when you're looking at the investing, population. I think some of those, if you ask me what's a wish list for what should happen in Amrit Kal, I think, the most important thing is engagement in advance so that, it's all very predictable and, very logical in terms of outcome of regulatory efforts.
And more specific on what you see the tax changes in...
No, I think I don't want to say the same points which Tushar already said. Obviously, top of the agenda, and I think earlier panels have spoken about how critical domestic capital formation is. And one big element of domestic capital formation obviously is tax. Today we have a very, and I think it's something that the government has acknowledged quite publicly as well, that, you have a big distortion when it comes to different asset classes. There's no logical reason other than just the way policy has evolved over many decades. And there are political sensitivities to it. So I think the current government is fairly disposed favorably towards this asset class. They understand that riskier asset classes cannot have more adverse tax treatment than liquid asset classes. So the hope is we'll see something change post the election, which is when bolder reforms can happen. That's the hope, that's a wish list. And of course, things like nagging issues like GST, I think is a big burning issue for everyone sitting in this room. It's something that does need to get resolved because, you can't have an asset manager give 60% of his economics away to tax. It doesn't leave any incentive for anyone to be in business. So, some of those would be
And maybe Cat 3 taxation.
The category 3 has been a long pending wish list.
Do you expect
unfortunately,
the
it's
forthcoming
not.
budget
Hopefully.
to have something for the
Hopefully.
industry to cheer?
Okay.
Okay. I think just moving on to you, Tejesh. I know you've also been both at the receiving end at times, as all of us as professionals are, and also at the end where we are trying to represent the industry. And in many ways, how has been your experience? And then in terms of and then maybe some thoughts around how you see the policy making from your perspective. And more importantly, how do you see things going forward? Do you see a change there? And maybe we'll probably have then something more I'm sure the audience will have also some questions to ask, but
Sure, thanks, Siddharth. Maybe to answer this, I will quote something which was famously said a couple of decades back. So, way back in 1716, it was said by in a book that the only two certainties in life are one, death, and second, taxation, right? So Christopher Bullock in 1716 said that, which was made more famous in the year 1789 by Benjamin Franklin, the biggest statesman in the US who never became president. And the question which was asked to him is that what will happen to the US Constitution when it's being adopted, right? Will it be permanent? Will it undergo changes? What will happen? And then he made the statement famous by saying, look, there are only two certainties in life, which is death and taxation. Now what is happening today is probably predicted the third one also, that it's taxation, it is death, and unpredictable laws or uncertain laws, which are the third certainties right now, right? So that is the regime where we are in. And globally, I think nothing to take away from SEBI in this regard, because they have beautifully regulated the public markets. Absolutely fantastic. The usage of tech and the concepts, we are way ahead than even the advanced economies, right? And when it comes to private capital, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that SEBI has been very vocal about it, that look, the way we have regulated the public market, we probably we are evolving, we don't know how to regulate the private capital that well, right? And why to blame SEBI, right? We are going back to the US SEC, and you saw a couple of months back the kind of changes they carried out in the private sort of capital regime when they amended the private advisor regulations in US. I think they implemented a lot of changes on the senior tranche, junior tranche, or the preferential redemptions, and a lot of these aspects, which SEBI actually had thought through a lot of months back or a couple of years back, right? So I think the regime is still evolving, but when we are talking about the Amrit Kal here, and we are talking about a lot of consultation papers which are coming, I think we slowly need to move to the regime of self-regulation also, right? Because what is Amrit Kal? Actually, what Mr. Modi would have uttered this a couple of years back on the 75th Independence Day, then it was very clear that there has to be parity between villages and cities, actually more usage of tech, and it has to be less interference of the government and administration in day-to-day affairs, right? So essentially you are talking about more governance and less government, right? So ultimately, and in the morning we had the benefit of listening to Mr. Anant Narayan, and he was categorical that the relationship between the mutual fund industry and SEBI, what existed 5 to 10 years back and what is today, actually has been very good, right? And one of the key reasons for that is MP, who has actually acted as not like a pseudo SRO. They are not a SRO in legal sense of it, but they have been acting as a bridge between the regulator and the industry, and something similar like this can happen to the AIF industry also over a period of time. If that can happen, then obviously we are talking about the notion of maximum governance and limited government, right, that way. So I think the self-regulatory regime is something what we have to move forward to, and that's the expectation. Yes, of course, as Paddy has rightly pointed out, there will be a few bad sheep, right? You will have some corner cases, and idea is that you penalize those wrongdoers, right? But you can't put the entire industry at stake just because there are a couple of wrongdoers. I think you need to deal with them separately.
And maybe you want to just talk about the standard operating procedure that I think SEBI has been talking about, and maybe in the same spirit of self-regulation. I mean, maybe some thoughts around it. How do you see that kind of really playing out?
No, I think
and maybe what role IVCA and other institutions can play on that?
No, very difficult question to ask, because the one thing which I have been struggling with that, what is IVCA going to tell SEBI, right? Because you can't have a unanimity of on most of these issues, right? You can't let 5 or 10 people decide that what will be the right percentage to look on a look-through basis, actually, whom do you exclude? So I don't know, like when SEBI is asking the industry to put what A, B, C, D, E are going to be prohibited, and industry is going to follow those restrictions, and we are not going to come out with the language what currently we have sort of suggested in the consultation paper on the code of conduct, but we'll wait for the industry only to come back and tell us what they are comfortable not doing. So I think it's going to be a really difficult task for IVCA. It's not going to be easy how to get a unanimity, but maybe a wider participation from the industry will be required. So since you can't have unanimity on issues like these, right? So with maximum consensus, whatever best can happen with the industry participation, I think that's the way to go about it.
Yep, no, I think that's, I don't know, maybe at this stage, if there are any thoughts, questions from the audience. Anyone? Kuldeep? Can we have the mic?
So I'd like to hear from the experts on the panel on what specific principle-based approaches can accelerate, what we want to do in Amrit Kal, because really what we want is a 10x growth, right?
Anyone from Gopal, maybe you want to?
I think to me, philosophically, the core issue is how do we go from, in cybersecurity, this idea of zero trust policies are extolled as being absolutely the perfect way to do cybersecurity. But in terms of industry and nation development, how do we go to a more trust-based approach is what strikes me. I mean, we can speak very technically and say, we'll have machine-readable regulation rules, and you can take your investment and run it through a RegTech backbone to SEBI, which will read your proposal and come back with answers with a latency of 9 seconds or whatever. All that sounds very nice. But the core issue, if you ask me, is a complete lack of trust, which is today informing India in many ways, not just SEBI. I wouldn't pick them up as exclusion. And I think it's part of our development because the standard deviation of India is so high in terms of levels of exposure, economic status, education. You can pick any, and it's really nice to see, right? This panel has got people from all over India. But this part of India now is well established. The Indians can work together. But this diversity of India creates this lowest common denominator, as our friends like to call it here, approach to regulation, where essentially laws are made assuming you're a criminal, effectively, right? If I put it very harshly, I don't think it's a correct statement. But therefore, I would say, how do we develop trust as we grow so we can trust each other? I think it's a national growth issue. It's like us going from adolescence to a young 20s or whatever is the right word to say. I would say that is the issue. And then I think automatically everything will follow. This lack of trust is such a common issue, right? But the mature economy, hopefully Amrit Kal, one of the characters will be maturity to trust each other.
And how do we achieve that is my specific question.
Yeah.
I think time, nothing else but time. I don't see.
We can't wait,
But right now, all of us have learned to enjoy the fact that our children are going to get Vikshit Bharat. So you enjoy it there also.
Mr. Modi has kept 25 years for that, right? So we have enough time for that.
No, but I mean, again, just how to achieve it, I think has to be fair, has to be at both hands. And I think maybe as I would look at it, the regulatory pendulum has obviously swung from one extreme to the other. And and we've always seen that happen in the past as well, where ultimately it does find a balance. The question is, how open the regulator is to kind of understand and take other perspectives from the industry on any of the policy making or changes, and how the industry also responds. So I think maybe some bit of self-regulation, and I think some of those principles, and I think the industry really seeing the larger good in having a framework which has good governance, has scalability, and obviously flexibility. Within that constraint, I think if some of these principles can be evolved jointly, I think that's probably the only way you can bridge the gap. I think that's probably how.
I could just add, Sid, so I don't misunderstand. Just like, for example, when you read Vedanta, you first start with yamas and niyamas. So the yama and niyama applies first to the large population, to all of us. Not to the regulator is only one very small part of that whole equation. If we start believing that compliance in our businesses is necessarily like a dharmic activity, then we will also behave differently. But if we are also going to constantly find arbitrage in every single move, obviously it'll take a longer time for trust to build.
Well, one question
any more?
right now, we say as an industry are more reactive to what the regulator is coming out with the regulations. So should it be as an industry be forthcoming in kind of designing something as a principle-based approach and then go to the regulator instead of regulator coming out with something and going to us?
In fact, the last IPAC, I don't know who suggested. I see Mr. Raman has also joined us. Hello, Raman. I don't know whether you were I think you were there in the IPAC also, where somebody suggested every law is now being rewritten in India or discarded. Isn't it time to write a brand new code for AIFs? Not trying to cut, I mean, as you know, I mean, at the cost of revealing my age, we know that in the VCF regulation there were a couple of typos. We also know they are replicated in AIF category 1 rules. So there is enough evidence, which I see you smiling also. You probably have a picture in your office of that. But I think we need to go from that to brand new code. And somebody, I think it was Gopal Jain who suggested that. I thought it was a fantastic idea.
I think, and we've seen that happen, right? I mean, if you look at FII, it's completely a new code with FPI, and I think it has, obviously, it will have to have its own challenges, and then, but I think at least, thankfully, we are not living in a situation where laws have remained unchanged, and I think the regulators have always periodically been reviewing it, so which I think is great. I think just coming...
IFSC, sorry to labor this more, but if you look at IFSC, the whole approach, and Tejas and I were on that committee who set up the FME, before the FME regulation was set up, the approach was to look at international kind of precedents and then select the best practices to come out with this FME.
So I was exactly coming to that.
So I know India will have its own challenges, so we'll need tweaks, but can we just start with that from a principle-based regulation perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And in fact, I was coming to that maybe as from even our own regulators here, right, IFSCA's approach, and then has probably been far evolved, and maybe at times they always say that we had, and I think we had the earlier panel where they said that they had the benefit of hindsight. And then versus a regulator who's developing it from scratch. So I think maybe some of the benchmarks can be taken from some of these more developed markets. I don't know if there are any other questions from the floor or any thoughts to share, anyone? We don't have the press here, so I think you can be free in expressing yourself. Okay, yeah, we have one. Can you introduce yourself so that at least there's a context?
Hello, I am Nikhil. I currently run a startup in renewable energy.
We can't hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So currently government has certain subsidies in the villages, and there are various programs by the government for the village communities. But I've been in talks with certain VCs about the same. But VCs have a very less interest when it comes to government or the startups which are working with the government. So certainly, is there, why are these things currently in the space?
Sorry, I think we couldn't hear it very well, and maybe if you can repeat the question.
A little louder, okay. So currently, government has given various subsidies in the rural market.
Correct.
And promoting various schemes in the rural sector of the India. But I had a talk with various VCs in the past, and they are very skeptical when it comes to government-based startups.
Government-based startups?
Or the startups that are dealing with the government on certain issues, like providing electricity to the villages or creating sustainable villages in all sense. So why the government and the VC or the private communities are not much aligned on the certain areas when it comes to the villages or the rural communities?
I'm sorry, I was not very clear on the question in terms of...
I also don't understand the question, but if at least at a state-to-state level, right, a lot of the B2G startups which have social impact. A lot of them are at a state, at a very micro level. And I think we should push this question to Mr. Raman also later because of SIDBI has a very keen interest in the subject. I think each state seems to have a lot of policies to encourage strongly. Some of them have very specific programs related to various departments to encourage startups to interact with agriculture, fisheries, solar power. So I don't know your question, but all I would like to say at a macro level, the government's role in creating India's AIF and startup industry is absolutely fabulous. I think it's like a benchmark. So I think, I'm not saying it because Raman is here from SIDBI, but these things have created industries actually.
Yeah.
So I can only speak for our industry, whether it's SRI fund now, SIDBI fund, before that there were other funds. So government has played a very active role in creating our industry.
Yeah. And to, again, if I've understood the question right, and I think if you really see alternate AIFs have really been the tool, a strategic tool being used by the government today. And I think that's really where we as an industry should also be proud that the government has recognized the potential of this pool of capital which can have a significant leverage. And I think Mr. Raman mentioned some of the numbers, that how 9,500 crore became a 58,000 crore plus with the leverage. And the same model, if you look at SRI and several other states are now emulating the model. So I think, and then a lot of them we have seen have really been directed to facilitate startups. And then states have really done a fantastic job, some of them, and more of them will be doing it. So I'm sure this will percolate down, this approach, private equity approach will probably percolate down to states and maybe rural areas as well. But I think, I don't know whether it answered your question, but happy to kind of engage, maybe post any other questions from the floor before? So, yeah, I'm mindful that we are also running out of the time for the panel here, but maybe I think one of the question in terms of more specific of on the industry side, and maybe any of the panelists here can, in terms of whether the choice of, is the industry kind of today very well aligned to what you would see globally, and I was coming more in the construct of choice of vehicles and some of those things. I mean, is there something that can be done better? I think maybe, I don't know, Paddy, if you want to talk about, and maybe from a regulatory side.
I guess from a commercial perspective, Sid, to your point, there are certain standard structures in fund management like LP structures. We don't really have that in India today. So we have a different structure, but why not give both options?
Yeah.
So that you can have LP structures along with trust structures, for instance. Some of the other elements now I think are, as I mentioned before, being taken care of at the IFSC level, like co-investment flexibility, which is so critical in a business like ours. That flexibility should also be there at the domestic level. There is no reason why Indians on onshore India can't do things just as well as they can in IFSC. I think the other element, of course, is leverage. There are elements of short-term leverage, things like subscription financing, which improve the quality of returns with very low levels of risk. Those, again, can be provided for. And finally, I would guess the last element, obviously, is just stability and predictability, which my fellow panelists touched upon. If we have those, if I may just add to the point on, what would be Amrit Kal if over the next couple of decades or so, the Indian alternatives industry can generate superior returns with lower volatility, right? So it boils down to what we call Sharpe ratio. So there will always be some cases where fund managers would be fraudulent, some cases where they were well-intentioned but went wrong. And the policymaker and regulator's goal should not be to reduce that. The KRA should not be to reduce that to zero, because that will never happen. That's not a practical goal. But the goal should be to enable for the industry superior returns over risk-free rates or whatever you are saying is the way you're measuring the alpha you're creating in this asset class with minimum volatility.
Sure, sure. Maybe Tejas, you.
Of course, there shouldn't be any hesitation in adopting something which globally has been accepted, has evolved over many decades, right? And that is exactly what was done for IFSCA gift regime as well, right? And as Gopal always says that we need to bring in some parity between the domestic capital and offshore capital, the way you regulate it. You can't have a gift city in India on the Indian shores actually, which has a complete separate regime compared to what we have for regulating the alternative investment funds, right? There are so many points which can be discussed, like the co-investment Paddy talked about. We have a complete separate regime on co-investment when it comes to IFSC regulations and the SEBI regulations.
In fact, now
or the
SEBI
sidecar
and IFSC
vehicles.
are like competing with each other now. It's almost like fund managers are.
So what do you think?
sort of
Is that a
choosing
good
between
idea, or you think
SEBI
to
should we
bring
go-
out the best in both, or you think it's counter?
And I don't know, I think with the level of sophistication that fund managers are reaching today from an India perspective, like look at the terms that, that we are offering out today in the market with the type of investors coming in. When we speak to our foreign counterparts on the law firm side, they're like, look, you're right up there in terms of so many of the commercial terms that are on offer today from what we were seeing 10 years back. New constructs like search funds and stuff are also gaining popularity in the Indian markets, right? So I think the regulatory environment also has to move. Like where in which other country will you see regulators regulating the term of the fund, or by when I should declare an initial closing, or by when my final closing should be achieved, or how much should be my diversification limit in which portfolio company? I mean, these are regulations which I don't think are there in most of the other countries. So therefore, I think even the regulatory regime has to catch up to.
Do you think, and again, this would be one of the big questions in every, do you think in Amritkal we'll move away from regulating funds to the fund managers? Okay.
I think that will
There
be-
you go.
yeah.
That's a good insight to have coming from Gopal, that we will have. Do you think we'll move to that model? I mean, I don't know. There's always been a talk about it. There have been consultation papers in the past.
And it's there in IFSC already.
It's there in IFSCA.
FME.
So why
FME,
not?
I learned that word, FME.
Yeah. So, okay. Maybe that's something that we can expect. I know we run out of time. I don't know if there's any one question from the audience we can take before we wrap up. I think, Gopal, I think you have a flight to catch.
Hi, I am Pankaj. So my question is essentially that, we spoke that, SEBI is coming up with a lot of paper on, the pooling of investment, like the new, like if it is evergreening of loan. So is it because, there are more bad men in the stakeholders than the good men in the, in the representative section or the policy making, that they are not getting, means, the peoples are coming with creative structures, and that's why the regulator has to come up with those, the papers technically, right? And therefore, the question is that, do we need a formal education or a degree for a fund manager to be in place so that they are aware that these are the regulations, these are the boundaries in which we have to play, and therefore, these problems will not arise essentially.
Well, again,
Essentially,
you're right. Maybe that's where I think the question was, maybe as an industry, what we need to do to make sure that we have a regime which is like our wish list of having that flexibility. But I would say it's always been a big question, and I think whether a regulator should always be a step ahead of the industry or should it be a step behind. There's no right or a wrong answer to it, but I mean, both have their own, and I mean, if they're a step ahead, many a times it can also end up stunting the development and the growth, because we are always trying to see and regulate it before a product even evolves to that level. And then I would say classic case of AIF has been, and the growth is because regulator has always let the industry evolve, and then the regulations have come in place to kind of address or facilitate the growth. So, I mean, again, I don't know whether what's the right answer, but the same consultation paper, if it says 30,000 crores worth of structures which have been seen as kind of abusive, versus an industry which is maybe, I don't know, 10 lakh, 11 lakh crore. I think one may need to take a considered view on and maybe how to deal with that bad apple, right? I mean, does it mean that I need to put everyone in the same bucket and then tighten the regulations to a level where it can stunt the development and growth of the asset class today? I mean, I think that's really an open question for everyone to debate. Thank you.
Sid,
Okay,
wrapping up,
I think
I have three sort of thoughts which occurred to me listening to this panel. The first is, I think, one for the regulator, which is to start going away from this investor protection as an obsessive mindset to financial stability, like what RBI has done. And then that allows a lot more things to take place, right? I think the second thing is, I think as far as the industry is concerned, right? I think we should be as obsessed with becoming managers of money to invest in other parts of the world. It's just going to happen before we know it. The balance of payments is going to go down from 0.2 to some positive, and domestic capital is going to surge, right? I mean, just think about EPFO money has doubled from 2018 to 2024, right? So we had to be prepared to have a global mindset as managers. Some country we take, some location we take. We should get obsessed with that idea. And to IVC, I think somebody's put very nicely saying, it's time for them to go back to the old days when they would actually produce thought leadership papers, like a new SEBI regulation, or a completely thought through tax framework, or how should we invest abroad, rather than be reactive. These three things I sort of took away in this panel.
Yep, no, I think great thoughts. Any concluding thoughts from anyone before we can wrap up? And I guess we have the awards on the other side of the panel. And yep, I think once again, thank you so much. I think to each of the panelists, I think we tried to keep it as interactive. Everyone's spoken their mind in some sense. I hope you can hear more of it when you kind of engage with them outside. But thank you once again for staying patient and be here on the last session of the second day. I think takes a lot, I can tell you that. So thank you once again, all of you, and have a great year till we meet again, I think, next conclave. Thank you.